Okay, go ahead and get set up. We'll get started in about a minute or so, in case anybody's running late. Go ahead and get brackets open. I know on some of your computers it can take a minute or so to get brackets up and running. Test, test, test. So while you're getting that set up, get brackets open. Keep an eye on your assignments. So assignment number 2 was due Friday. I'll get that graded soon. Assignment number 3 is due in 1 week. We'll go through another example today that was similar. We'll go through it a little bit faster than last time. So make sure that you've got that started or hopefully finished. The one thing that we didn't do last week was the image, which we'll talk about today. Image is fairly simple, but we'll talk about that. Okay, everything's going. Okay, any questions before we get started? Everyone's got brackets open? Everything's good? Okay, so let's go through and, by the way, just to let you know, we're going to have a midterm in a few weeks, so I'll make the announcement probably like a week before, but just keep in mind that we're going to have that at some point. Okay, so today's the 22nd, so I'm going to go into my CGS1821 folder, File, New Folder. Today is 9/22/2020. Everyone's got their masks. Perfect. Okay. And then go to brackets, and we will go to File, Open Folder. So find your CGS1821 folder, and then go to today's date, 9/22/2020. And then File, New, which gives us a blank file. And we will fill that with HTML shell. So we'll go to HTML shell. Copy and paste that in there. And then we're going to save this as ex1.html. So go to File, Save. Should default to the correct folder, 9/22/2020, and then we'll call this ex1.html. In grading the assignments, make sure that you have this extension installed, because I did notice some people with things that weren't indented too well. So I don't want to go through that too fast. There's a little icon over here for Extension Manager. So I've got it installed, but you would go to Available, type it in, So rather than update, yours would say install. And then you can have it do proper indentation on an as-needed basis, but I usually just like to set it to every time it saves, it correctly indents. It's not perfect. If you have code mistakes, it's not going to know how to indent correctly, and every once in a while it'll do some weird indentations, but for the most part it's pretty decent. The reason we indent code is to make it more readable. Okay, so everyone's good. I tried to go through that kind of slow so everyone could catch up. Okay, so let's go ahead and just do some basic HTML. So let's create a page with a navigation. So there's this tag called nav, which stands for navigation. And then you'll remember from your previous assignment that we had UL, which what does UL stand for? Exactly, unordered list. And what we can actually do is, rather than just a bunch of items in a recipe, what we can actually do with UL is use it for navigation, because as it turns out, it doesn't really matter if it's a bunch of items for your recipe or a bunch of links, it's still list items. So it's very common to take this navigation tag and put a UL in here for unordered list. Also remember from your assignment that many of these are kind of open-ended on how you can use them, like div and main and footer, but some require a very specific structure. UL and table were the examples. Now in practice you don't use table all that often, but I use ULs all the time. And the way it works is that you have to have your UL, and then within that the individual list items. And it will be very generic, and so we'll say LI. Now we can just type something in here, but let's actually this time put a real link. So remember we talked last time how to do a link. We would do the A tag for anchor, and then we use this thing here called href, which stands for hyperlink reference. We're not going to point it anywhere right now because we don't have anywhere interesting to go to. And we'll just be very generic and just say link 1. So got this nav tag. Now again, you can get away with not using these. It's just your site doesn't have the structure isn't as good. It's not going to get picked up by search engines as easily. Any sort of what they call accessibility technologies, like screen readers, aren't going to be as good at picking it up. Okay, but we could just use divs for everything, really, if we really wanted to. But the idea is to give your page some sort of structure. So we're creating our site's navigation, so we put it inside of nav, which links tend to be, for whatever reason, I think it's just historical. A lot of people do it. We put links as an unordered list. And let's have 3 links should be all right. So we'll cheat and copy and paste. Link 1, link 2, link 3. Make sure to copy from here to here, the link item and the link. So we've got this A, which stands for anchor. You don't really have to worry about that, but the part you care about is this href, which stands for hyperlink reference. Now remember how HTML elements work is that we've got the start of the tag here and the close tag here, but then we have the actual content. The stuff between is what's displayed to the user. And then this other stuff is sent to the browser. So in this case, href equals, this is where I'd actually put my hyperlink. The user doesn't really need to know the hyperlink. A lot of browsers, actually, if you hover over it, they will tell you. Like if you hover over here, see at the bottom left. But the user doesn't have to know, but the user does need to, like the intent of this is to show to the user which link it is. Does that make sense? So we've got our nav. And by the way, so I hope I'm not moving too fast for anybody, am I? Okay. Remember that it needs to be inside of the body. So let's, again, go back to the basic structure here, is that we have this boilerplate code that's the same every single time. This part here, including the body. So this part here, stuff at the bottom. Every single time in all of our pages so far, this has been the same. Then we put here our HTML. So if I see assignments like that's incorrect. It's outside of the body. Has to be inside of the body. Or sometimes I'll see stuff like all this stuff up here has to be in the certain order in the correct area. Okay. By the way, I think one of the things that we'll get to this can be confusing. There's a tag called head, which we'll go over at some point, but there's another tag called header. These are different. Even though they kind of have similar names, they're actually used differently. So we've got our navigation here, our individual list items for our navigation. That's good enough. Then maybe in the main part of our page, there's another tag. Okay, so now we're getting a little bit more complex. When we started off, we did very, very simple things. Now we're putting tags inside of tags. We want to kind of stick to this structure. And the main content of the page you usually put here inside of the main tag. Then we can have our article. And I think we briefly talked about article, correct? I think we've talked about article before. And I want to say there's actually like a dedicated link to article. This is kind of a simplified version. Maybe I'll add another link here. But article, it's, again, a lot of these are very open-ended. The commonalities that you'll see with an article is, think about like a news article. News article would typically have like a title, some sort of content, but it doesn't have to necessarily be a news article. A comment, or let's say, for example, you're on let's say a blog, and what they might have is the title of the blog article, some preview content, like maybe like the first few sentences of the article, and at the bottom they may have something that says like read more, or say for announcements. So let's do something like that. So again, a lot of these are very open-ended, but a very common thing I've seen with article is that we'd have our article, and then we would have a header. And like I said before, header is not the same thing as head. This is different. And then from here we can use, remember H1? H1 doesn't have to be like at the top of your page is the title of the page. In this case it makes sense because we've got some article here, and it's the H1 as it relates to the article, not the entire page, but in H1. So we might say IRC. Let's pretend we're doing like an IRC themed website. So that might be like your main title, and then maybe you have an H2 underneath it that has so this is like the header. And then you might just have a bunch of individual paragraphs. So again here, this is the main content of our page. This is one article, but it's not uncommon to have a bunch of articles. Like if each one of these articles will say, for example, a news story, but maybe just a preview of the news story, where you've got a listing of all the 10 most recent news stories or announcements. They might just give you a small preview, and then you click on it, and then it gives you the full article. So let's get one paragraph of lorem ipsum text. I'll just pause for a second to make sure nobody's falling behind. So we have our main. And then within this, if we had a second article, we're not going to do this, but we would put the second article here. But in this case, we're just going to pretend like we just have the one article. And that article can have a header. Doesn't have to, but I've found that a lot of times you do this header here. And then we've got our paragraph. And then sometimes what I'll see too is like maybe as a footer. So the article itself can have a footer. Maybe it just says something generic like, maybe it's a link that says read more, and then you click that link. Maybe that would be a hyperlink. So we started off very simple. We started off just with H1s and paragraphs and some other basic things, and then we moved on to just learning some more of those. Then we went on to some of these elements that require very specific structure, so lists and tables. And now we're just kind of putting this all together. Now notice that this doesn't have any styling at all. So, or really it has its default styling, which is not that interesting. But we don't really care about that right now because we're going to learn CSS. And so right now we're just focused on the structure. That's why I didn't really preview it, because it doesn't really look that interesting. But all you can do is catch maybe some basic errors in your typing. But it is very highly structured. We've got our proper nav here with our unordered list and our individual links as list items. Then we've got the main part of our page. And in this case, we had one article, but we might have multiple articles, which we would put in another article right there. And an article can reasonably have a header. That might be like the title of the article. And then sometimes you'll have like a second title. So we did that as an H2. Yes?
Is the nav always associated with the link? Like, does it always have to be?
I've never seen it not, but you could theoretically, I guess not, but I've always seen it as like navigation with a hyperlink.
Okay.
And then and then we had our actual content and then footer. Now, again, these things aren't like set in stone. I might decide, okay, I've got a footer here, but I also might want a footer for my entire page that just says something generic like copyright 2020. And this is closer to something you'd see in the real world. Now, you might not see that right away because there's no styling associated with it, or like I said, it's just the default. But you could take this HTML right here, put some styling on it, and then this be a real page. So this is a very highly structured page. If you wanted to, you could even put a header at the top. But this is, I think, as it stands, this might be pretty typical. At the top, you might have a banner, but I'm not going to really worry about that right now. Okay, any questions on any of this? And I think I'm trying not to throw any new tags at you. I think we've covered all of these at some point or another, right? Header, footer, article, H1, paragraph. Okay. And have we talked about main before? If not, main is just the main content of your page. You don't have to have a main, but I'm noticing that they're getting more and more popular. So say, for example, if we were on a page on the IROC website, let me find a... this text, let me see if I can get a better example. Yeah, so this right here, this would all be inside of main. Now, just as a quick side note, it's not uncommon to have multiple navigation. So what I mean is that a lot of times you'll have a primary navigation that's valid for the entire site, but then you might have navigation that's specific to a certain area of the page. So in this case, you can see that it's not super obvious, but this to me appears to be like navigation, and it's just some links over here. And this might be like a secondary navigation that's only really valid for this area of the site. Okay, but to me, in this case, this stuff right here would be under main, not including this. I'd put this just as nav. This would be nav. This might be a header, depending. I'd have to think about it. Bless you. I'm not sure how. I probably wouldn't do this as a header, but. And then the footer should be fairly obvious. This, everything in blue here, this would be an example of a real world footer, okay? So let's go back to doing our links. So again, I'll go through this very slow because it's very important that you go through this process. But that's just some HTML review. That's about as complicated as we're going to get with the HTML, I think, in this class. So if you understand that example, you should be okay as far as HTML goes. Now, we still have a lot of CSS to go through, but that should be good on HTML. So open up some sort of, in Mac, they call it Finder. On Windows, it's called File Explorer. And then go to your folder for today. And we're going to do like we did last week, where we make a new folder. So make sure you're in the 922 folder. We're going to make a new folder for today, and we're just going to call it links. So I'm going to go through this very slow, and I'm going to repeat steps when possible. So we're in Finder or File Explorer. Right-click, new folder, and we're going to call that folder Links. Go inside of that Links folder. And we're going to make another folder called Admissions. Now, remember we talked about the naming. What we want to do is all of our pages and all of our folders, we want to be all lowercase with no spaces. Because this is going to cause problems later if we don't do exactly like this. It has to do with case-sensitive operating systems. So we're going to create I know that's a little bit small. Let me see if I can zoom in here. So inside of our links folder, we've created another folder called Admissions. And then let's make another folder called Images. Okay, so this sets up the basic structure. That way we don't have to go and add some folders later. So within links, you should have admissions and images. Now, inside of brackets, it might be a little bit difficult to see, but you should see that links folder that you just created. That should appear. And we have admissions and images. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go to File, New, And we'll paste in our HTML shellcode. So copy, paste. Now we're going to save it in a slightly different place than we normally do. So again, under resources, we have HTML shell, or you can just type it directly, htmlshell.com. And then we just copy and paste the code here. Now, I'm going to go to save, but I don't want to just save it inside of this folder. I want to go inside of the links folder like we did last week. So double click links. So again, by default, when you go to save it, it's going to default here, but we want to go inside of this links folder. Make sure that you don't click admissions or images, because we don't want to put it inside of those folders. We want it to be directly inside of links. And then we're going to call it index.html, which is a very special name that we'll learn about more as the course goes on. But just know that index.html is a special name. That's why it's not just ex1 or ex2 or anything like that. It's recognized by the web servers as being something different. And we'll be very generic. This will just be our home page. Let's go through the process again. We're going to go to File, New, paste in our HTML. File, save. Inside of the links folder, make sure again, it defaults to our folder for today's date. We want to go inside of the links folder, and we should see our index.html, and we're going to call this FAQ.html, which stands for frequently asked questions. It's a very common page name you'll see. So we're inside of this links folder. We're not inside of admissions or images, we're just inside of links. We should see our index.html folder, and then we're going to create this new page called FAQ. Sometimes they'll call it FAQ, frequently asked questions. And again, we'll be very generic with this page. Right now we'll just have an H1 so we can tell the pages apart. Okay, so everyone has that basic structure so far? Okay, so let's go back to our index page, and if we're on our home page, our index.html page, we might want to link to our frequently asked questions. So inside of a paragraph, I'm going to have a href, which stands for hyperlink reference. Notice that we're already getting some help here from our autocomplete, and I'm just going to say, okay, I want to link there. Say link to. So remember the rules with hyperlinks. If I'm going to an external site that's not on the same server, there's no way about it around it. I just have to grab this entire thing here, copy it. It needs the what's called the protocol. It needs the DNS name. It needs everything. Most of the time, though, we're just linking to pages within our own site. So if the page happens to be on the same server and also in the same folder, as we see here, so we'll pretend our computer right now is a server. and we've got our 2 pages here, all we have to do is put the page name. These are called relative links. You're saying relative to where I currently am. There's another type called absolute. I don't really do absolute links anymore because they're very fragile. Many people did not know really how to use them correctly, and there's just a lot of reasons to avoid them. I almost across the board tend to use relative links unless there's a very good reason not to. So if you're searching on like W3 schools, you might see reference to things called absolute links. They're important, don't get me wrong, and when used properly, they're very powerful, but I've just noticed a lot of people, when I was teaching this class, were getting confused by them and weren't using them correctly. So it's just easier to teach you how to use relative links and get really good at those, because in general, you can do the same thing with both. So if I go to preview, so I'm going to close this. Update that, it's going to keep on asking me. But now's not the time. If I click here, it takes me to the frequently asked questions. So what I want you to do on this frequently asked questions page is, inside of this paragraph, create a link that says go back home or back to home page or something like that. And so take a couple minutes to do that. So right now you should be on frequently asked questions.html FAQ. And you want that to, when the user clicks that link, take them back home. Okay, so somebody walk me through it. What do I have to put right here where my cursor is? So again, I'm on FAQ.html. Walk me through it. What would I put here? Say it a little louder. Yeah, so we start off with our anchor, and then what's next? Perfect. href, which stands for hyperlink reference. It's saying where I'm pointing to. And then what would I put inside these double quotes? Perfect. Index.html. And then remember, the stuff between the start and the end of the tag is what the user sees. So we could just say home. They would know. Usually you get some sort of visual cue that it's a link. And so now we can go back and forth between these two pages. So that's the simple case. Now, it's very common that if you've got a bunch of related pages, or in this case, if you're IRSC, a single department like admissions might have a bunch of pages, you'd typically want to organize those into a folder. You could put everything right in what's called the root. You could just dump 200 pages in there, but it's not going to be very organized. So what we tend to do is organize things into folders and sometimes subfolders if we need to. And so we created our admissions folder. Normally we'd have many pages, but let's just pretend we're just putting one page inside of admissions. So let's go to File, New, copy and paste in our HTML shell again. And then so we're going to save this. It should be obvious, not in links directly. So we want to go into links, but then we want to go into admissions, and maybe this is just to apply. So we'll call it apply.html. And we'll put an H1 just so we know which page we're on. Say, how about application? And then from there, you'd have the like a form to apply to the college. So let's make sure we have our folder structure correct. Is that inside of links, I've got my index and frequently asked questions pages. I've got my admissions folder, and within that folder I have one page called apply.html. Now if we go back to brackets to our index.html page and we do another paragraph, we might want to link to that application page. Now we can't just type in apply.html. Why not? Because with relative pages, we're saying relative to where I currently am. I'm sitting in this folder right now because I'm on index.html and I don't see apply.html anywhere. Whereas that page, I would have to go into the admissions folder to get to that page. So what do I have to type? So I can't type that. What do I type here in the double quotes instead? Perfect. Yeah, so we're saying go into the admissions folder, / which is a separator, separates different folder names and file names. And then we can see here, okay, so it found that page, apply.html. And if we click apply now, it takes us to that page. So the first case was when you're linking to an external server. You just need the full, what's called the URL, Uniform Resource Locator. If we're linking to pages on the same server, if those pages happen to be in the same exact folder, we don't have to do anything. We just type in the file name. If it's in a subfolder relative to where I currently am, I type in the folder name and then the page name. Now the last case that we talked about was, what if I'm inside of a page like this and I want to go back to the home page? Exactly, yeah. So what's happening right now is I'm here, apply.html. It's tough because we know how to go into a subfolder, but really what I want is I want to go up out of this folder. Like if you were to actually do this on in this case, Windows Explorer, or I'm sorry, File Explorer, there's this up arrow, and I press this up arrow and it takes me out of the admissions folder up to the links folder. We kind of need to do the equivalent. So again, if I'm inside of the admissions folder, because I'm at this page, apply.html, I need a way to get out of this folder to be able to navigate to other pages or folders. So the way we do that is, does anybody else, I don't know if anybody heard? Okay, well, I'm guessing everyone probably heard you. So We do ... which means go up one level. Now be careful not to go up too many levels because you can break your page. I see this a lot of times in homework assignments, is that people... So I can do things like this and get back to my home page. The problem is that depending on your site, this actually may break when you try to upload to a server. We've gone too far. We don't actually need to go up this far. So only go up as far as you need to. In this case, we only need to go up one level. So ... means go up one level. And then from there, we can get to our index page. Is everyone good with that? So you might think this is kind of complicated. Why don't we just use the full URL for everything? You generally want to avoid that because what will happen sometimes is that links change, site names change, folders get renamed, things get moved around. This method that I use is pretty resilient to change. I can move this folder to other places. I can rename things outside of the folder and it doesn't affect it. With that full URL, I'll take you through the most obvious example, is that at one point IRSC was called IRCC. Imagine if every single link on the site used the full URL and they changed the name from IRCC to IRSC. How would I handle that? I'd have to go through and change every single link. It's not a fun process. Usually you'd have to write a separate program to go through and crawl and do some text processing in all of your code. It's not a fun process. However, using this method, you wouldn't have to do anything different because it's not dependent on that full URL. So again, it's very resilient to change. So that's essentially what we did last class, but I like to go through that process again because I've noticed in the past that it's probably one of the things that people have difficulty with. Now, a couple of notes, and we're going to get to images in a second. All my page names need to be lowercase. Why is that? And same thing with folder names. Well, Windows and Mac are what's called case insensitive. So if I had created the page called apply with a capital A versus a lowercase a, Windows and Mac don't see the difference. And so most people create a site on their computer first, and you go through and you go to all your page links and everything seems to work. Most web servers, especially the web hosting companies that you can get like a plan for like a few bucks, like I've seen them as cheap as like a couple bucks, those tend to use Linux or Unix-based servers. Most of the time these days they're just Linux-based. And they put like thousands of pages on or it's thousands of sites, maybe even tens of thousands on a single server. Those are case sensitive. So what often happens is that you've got a bunch of pages that work on your computer, but as soon as you actually upload it to your real web hosting company, it will break. Okay, so just as a general rule, which we've already been doing, but name all of your page names and folder names lowercase. Okay, notice that we did admissions, images, all these as lowercase. Now, one thing that may not seem super obvious that we've also, because we've had short file names, is that we want to avoid spaces. So if you had a page that was about me.html, usually you can just call it about, but let's say you wanted to use about me. We wouldn't use spaces because a lot of times what ends up happening is that we get URLs that get filled in by %20s. And usually you want to have readable URLs. Now, some sites are really bad at this. Blackboard does not make readable URLs. They don't even try. But IRSC, we have pretty readable URLs. I look at this, and it's pretty obvious what page I'm at, correct? I'm in the About folder, looking at the Overview page. If you're here, it's really not clear at all. You've got a bunch of internal names that are code names like list content editable.jsp with content IDs, and to me that's not very readable. We've got pretty reasonably readable URLs. Let's see if I can find an example of the dash. Perfect. So notice here, Veterans Services, notice the dash. That's considered best practice. Also notice that everything's lowercase, but here we've got Veterans-Services. What happens is if you don't do that, you end up a lot of times with these %20s, which can make readability kind of it's not as readable. So instead we just replace those with dashes. Now in practice, most pages don't need a dash, but I mean, we didn't have to look that far on the IRC website to find a page with a dash, so, you know, it's not non-existent. There are, every once in a while, you'll have a multi-word page, or in this case, multi-word folder. So now so any questions about that? Let's just, as a one final test, we should be able to navigate everywhere on our site. So I'm at the home page. I can get to my frequently asked questions. From there, I do from there, because it's in the same folder, I can go back home. Now the apply now, that's in the admissions folder. So it goes into the admissions folder, and it found that page. And then finally to get back home, because I need to go up one level, we did .. and then that takes me back home. So our site, we can navigate to every single page. Now images, once you know all that, images are they're really easy. So let's grab an image. Let's say, for example, the IRC logo. So go to the IRC website. You should be able to, maybe I can just download it and let's see if it's going to take me. Yeah. Hold on, let me just get. I'll type the full word, Indian River, and then I'll put this under resources. Probably way too large. Let me see if I can get a smaller. This will work. Perfect. 200 by 250. Okay, so if you go to resources, it's all the way at the bottom. You can put it. It's all the way at the top now. So if you might have to click refresh. So click resources, and then you'll see IRC image file. And then from there, what you can do is you can right click and then save image. Now in my case, it's in the downloads. We're good on time. I'll just wait a second. Okay, so you go to resources, and then open file here, and then from there you can just right click. Different browsers have different wording, but it's going to be something like save image. So in my case, it ended up in the downloads. So I'm going to copy. Then go to CGS1821, today's date, links, and then remember earlier we made a dedicated folder just for images. We'll go ahead and put it there. By the way, for your assignment, you can use the same image. I don't think I'm very specific on what image to use. So now if we look inside of our folder, we should have all of our pages, but now inside of images, we have our IRC image here. I think I said in the assignment probably PNG, but actually I don't care that much. JPEG is fine as well. Now we'll be lazy about it. We'll put it right on our index page at the bottom here. The way image works is we do img src, so the source of the image, equals. Now before we had href, which stood for hyperlink reference. This is very similar. All the stuff you learned about relative links and going up a level and all that's all still the same. So what folder is my image? Where is that located? What's the name of that folder? Images, right? So first I have to go to into the images folder, and then what's the name of my image? Exactly, irc.jpg. So you might think, okay, this is a little bit strange because now wouldn't we have to do something like this and then some text for the user to see? In a certain number of cases where there's no text for the user to see, we don't actually put the closing tag, or what's called self-closing tags. In this case, it makes sense because I'm showing the user an image, and the browser is going to render that image. There's no text to actually show to the user, so we don't put anything else. We just do image source equals and then this. Now, one more quick thing. There's something called it's just called alt. So we have our HTML attributes. There's an attribute called alt. Again, this is for screen readers, and this is for if for some reason the person can't see and they can't see the image. So we usually like to put in some sort of alternate text that a screen reader would read, or maybe even like a website crawler to know what the image is. And then we could just be very generic and say like IRC. I think it was the IRC seal, correct? It wasn't really the logo, it's just the seal. And notice now that if we hover over the image, hopefully it'll work. Usually it says the alternate text, but in this case, for whatever reason, it's not. I think it's a browser specific thing, but anyway. But it's there. So it's generally a good idea to have that alt text for those two reasons. There might be others, but the main two are for accessibility and for search engines. So you should have everything at this point to do your assignment. I know many of you get your assignment started last week. We do have about 20 minutes left. I don't want to get behind on the our schedule for the semester, so I'm going to move on to the to just kind of starting on CSS. We're not going to get very far, but I want to give you some background and maybe just some very, very basic things. Any question on anything regarding relative links? So like when they're in the same folder, different folders, how to go up level, any of that stuff? how to link to an image? Everyone's good with that? Last chance. Okay. So I'm just going to collapse this. So I'm back to my example 1. Get rid of some of this stuff that we're not using right now. I'm using article. So under resources, we've been working mostly with W3 Schools HTML. Notice that if you scroll to probably about the bottom half of the page, you'll see a link to W3 Schools CSS. So this is where we're going to spend the next few weeks, is inside of this CSS section. So let's go back to the web. Let's talk about Tim Berners-Lee, all this stuff. When they first created the web, there wasn't really any focus on how things looked. I mean, there was a little bit of focus. If you'll see that there's like a there's a tag for fonts. There's some other tags in here, like bold, italics. And so the idea was that HTML is pretty good at structure, and anything for how things are supposed to look, let's just make a tag for it. So they had a font tag, they had a bold tag. And everyone quickly realized that HTML is really not great at that. It's really, really good at structure. If we go back to our first example from today, this to me is a very highly structured page. I look at this, I know exactly what's going on here. I've got a navigation and then a list of hyperlinks. In the main area of my page, I've got an article with this title, some footer. To me, this is very highly structured. It tells us absolutely nothing about how the page is supposed to look. Now, what they used to do is insert things like font, but we were actually really limited in what we could do. To give you a sense, I think we've already gone through this, but to see what pre-CSS websites looked like, this is what the first iteration of Amazon looked like, okay? So you could do very basic things like background colors, some fonts, but really not much at all as far as styling goes. Now, again, this is probably highly structured, but the actual styling wasn't there. So what ended up happening is that we created a, back to CSS here, kind of a separate thing that works with HTML called CSS. Now, the acronym stands for Cascading Style Sheets. Now, most of that we don't care about, but there is one word that we do care about, and that's style. If we want to do any sort of styling of our page, essentially changing how it looks, we're going to use CSS. And this is usually the part of the course where it starts to get interesting for most people, because you actually that's why you're here, is not to structure pages, but to make them look a certain way. So CSS, cascading style sheets. Now, you put CSS code in your HTML at certain locations, but the CSS code looks much different. And we have these things called CSS properties. And there's way too many to count. There's probably hundreds, I'm sure, CSS properties. We can control everything from background colors and basic things like that and fonts. We can also change margins and padding, but we can also do things as detailed as, remember when we were doing unordered lists and the default styling was a bulleted list? We can even go as far as to change the different types of lists. We can change that to an image if we want to. We can change it to just something standard like a square. So there's a huge number of things. Now, there's way too many CSS properties to go over in this class, so what I usually do is just show you some of the basics. And again, just like with lists and tables, there are certain properties that need special explanation, so I usually show you a handful of common things, some things that need special explanation, and then from there you can learn more on your own if you want to take it further. Okay, so CSS. So I don't really necessarily like the way that W3 Schools introduces this, so I do skip around a little bit. So right now I'm on CSS How-To. There are 3 ways to actually include CSS on your page: internal, external, and inline. Now in this class I don't usually cover external because it makes the examples very difficult to show, because when you have external it's in a separate file. Now in practice you actually generally do have external files, but the nice thing is these two, internal and external, are almost the exact same. Literally the only difference is that you take the code from being in the same file so you put it into a separate file. So everything that you learned with this thing called internal you can apply. So we're just going to concentrate on these two, internal and inline. Now I actually, even though they do this in a different order, I actually like to introduce inline first because it tends to make more sense. So I'm on CSS How-To, and I want everyone to scroll down to inline CSS and click the try it yourself. Now to me they have way too much going on here, so let's just go ahead and get rid of some of that extra stuff and just get it to where it says color is blue and color is red, and click run. So the way this works is this is inline CSS. We're doing this inline. So what does that mean? Within the actual tag, we have a property, an HTML attribute called style, basically your CSS, equals, and then everything between these double quotes is going to be CSS code. The nice thing is that all the CSS that we learn here, we can apply it just the same to this other thing called internal CSS and even to external CSS. It's just how you include it is just slightly different. So you have style equals and then some stuff between the double quotes. So the way this works is that we have a CSS, what's known as a property. In this case, we have a property called color. So we have the property name, colon, and then a value. In this class, I generally like to stick to just simple color names like blue, red, but you can do RGB values, hex values, all that. I generally don't do them because it doesn't really add anything to the class, and to me it's just easier to type blue and red than it is. But in your other classes, I'm pretty sure most people are already familiar with that, hex values and RGB values and all those different coloring systems. So we do the property name, colon, and then the value, and then a semicolon at the end. Now you'll notice that H1 and P are different elements, different tag names, but they both deal with text. The nice thing about these properties is that the bulk of these properties can be used for anything. There are some special cases, like I already mentioned, lists. Using CSS properties for lists wouldn't really make sense in a paragraph, so we couldn't use them here. But basic stuff like colors, fonts, that sort of stuff, doesn't really matter if we're using it in an H1, paragraph, article, any of that. And you'll notice in this case, so here they set the color to blue, here they set the color to red. This rule is it's only applied from the start to the end of the tag. So notice that if I had another H1, it wouldn't apply to this. It would just get its default styling. So only from here to here is that color blue applied. Because this is, even though it's another H1, it's just outside of it, so it doesn't get the styling. If we wanted to apply multiple properties, all we have to do is after this semicolon, another property. So there's, or actually, sorry, let's do something else first. So under this paragraph, so I'm not going to run it just yet. Do you think the word is, do you think that will be red, yes or no? So let's go ahead and try it. So I run. And so now it's a little difficult to see, but that has been emphasized, which by default the styling is italics. And notice that it is red. Why is it red? Because from here, yeah, exactly. It's inside of the paragraph, so even if we have other tags inside of this,
it'll still remain whatever, as long as it's inside of the paragraph or the style, then it will remain the style.
exactly, yeah. So from here to here, because it's inside of there, it gets that styling. So let's look at some common properties. So we have text formatting. We already saw color. So let's say, for example, we want to underline something. There's a property here called text decoration. By the way, this is very common. You'll see like anything related to text, they'll be grouped together. So you'll have like text dash something. So in this case, we have one called text dash decoration underline. So let's go back here. If we wanted to add another, we would say, okay, here the color is blue, and we would also say that text decoration underline. And what I'm going to do, remember we can do this. I could break this up into multiple lines. Don't worry about this. This is just an unfortunate thing. By default, it didn't put it through the G. I don't think there's a nice way around that, by the way. I guess what you could do is put some padding or something underneath it, and maybe then it would go through it, but I'm not super concerned with it right now. So this colon right here, I'm sorry, the semicolon, this is like basically saying end of this rule. So we're saying color, colon blue. So this is all one CSS property. We've got the property name and then its value. And then same thing here, this is all one. So here we're applying two rules, that it's blue and it's underlined. So today I just wanted to introduce this. I think this is a good stopping point, but just so we have a copy of this, let's take this example that we were just working on. Let's copy it, and let's do file, new, and let's paste it inside of brackets, and we'll call this, make sure to put it in the right spot, so the 922 folder, and we'll just call this ex2.html. And I'll leave this up here for a second in case anybody needs to type. Maybe I'll format it a little bit nicer. Okay, so we only have 5 minutes left. I would say that, so I'm going to stop streaming here.